"You'll regret this. I won't obey," native girl said when the cowboy paid $2 for her at the auction. The sun had just begun to rise over the endless Montana plains, casting long golden streaks across the rough wooden fences and the dry, cracked earth of John Marlowe's ranch. A cold wind blew softly, carrying the faint smell of smoke from the small stove inside the ranch house. John, a tall, lean man in his late 40s, was already hard at work outside. His hands, rough and calloused from years of handling tools and cattle, moved steadily as he stacked split firewood in neat, careful rows near the barn. The wood, cut from trees that had grown stubbornly along the riverbank, had been drying for weeks, and John knew it would be needed for the long, harsh winter ahead. John had lived on this land his entire life. He was born on the ranch his father had built, learned the work of cattle and crops from him, and had continued the family tradition when his father passed away. Over the years, the ranch had become more than just land. It was a routine, a sanctuary, and at times, a cage. John liked his solitude. The quiet of the plains, the sound of the wind through the grasses, and the occasional calls of distant birds made a rhythm that was comforting. He rarely had visitors, and he had come to prefer it that way. He had no wife, no children, and few friends. His life was his work, and his work was his life. As he lifted another heavy log, balancing it carefully on the stack, he noticed movement near the edge of the field. At first he thought it was a deer or some other animal wandering too close to the barn, but as he squinted against the morning sun, he saw a figure walking toward him. She was a woman, small in stature, carrying a satchel and wearing a worn coat that flapped slightly in the wind. Her hair was tied back neatly, but a few loose strands fell across her face, and John could see the curiosity in her eyes as she took in the sight of his ranch. John paused mid-motion, his arms full of wood. He didn't recognize her, and his first instinct was to ignore her. Visitors were rare, and he wasn't used to explaining his life to strangers. But the woman didn't come close immediately. She stayed a few feet away, looking around respectfully, as if she didn't want to disturb him. Her presence was quiet, almost hesitant, but it was enough to make John stop stacking the firewood and set the log down carefully. "Can I help you?" John asked, his voice steady but cautious. He wiped the sweat and sawdust from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, his eyes never leaving hers. The woman took a small step forward and smiled gently. "I'm Martha," she said softly. "I'm a teacher from town." John froze.
His sister. It had been years since he had thought about her.
His lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment he wasn't sure what to say. His sister Mary had been gone for nearly a decade. Her memory was tucked away in dusty corners of his mind, kept safe but untouched. He had never been one to speak about her to anyone, not even to himself most days. And now, here was a stranger, holding pieces of her in her hands, offering them to him like a bridge to the past he had tried to forget. "Letters?" John asked cautiously, his voice low. I don't know what letters you mean." Martha shook her head slightly, opening her satchel and pulling out a few carefully folded envelopes. The paper was old, edges slightly yellowed, but still in good condition. "She wanted you to have these," Martha said. Her voice was calm, kind, but there was a subtle tremor in it, as though she too felt the weight of the moment. "I promised her I would deliver them." John looked at the letters, then back at her. The wind carried a faint scent of pine and earth, and for the first time that morning, he felt the stillness around him shift. He wanted to tell her to leave, to go back to town and forget she had ever seen his ranch, but something in her eyes held him in place. They weren't demanding, they weren't expecting anything, just waiting, quietly, patiently. He turned and walked a few steps away, reaching for another log. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to think, but he also didn't want to ignore what had just happened. "Stack the firewood, ready to leave," he said finally, his voice firm but not unkind. It was his way of keeping control, of keeping the world simple and predictable again. He expected her to follow his instructions, to do what she needed to do, and leave. Martha nodded slightly but didn't move immediately. Instead, she watched him work for a few moments, her eyes scanning the neat rows of stacked wood, the barn with its weathered boards, and the vast fields stretching beyond. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt. She simply waited, letting John maintain the rhythm of his work, letting the silence settle around them. John felt a strange mix of irritation and curiosity. He hated how her presence disrupted his routine, yet he couldn't bring himself to look away. He thought of his sister, of the long years they had shared as children, running through the fields, hiding from chores, laughing until their sides hurt. Memories he had buried deep inside him surfaced, unexpected and unwelcome. He shook his head slightly, trying to push them away. The ranch was no place for nostalgia, he told himself. Life was measured in work, in chores completed, in the firewood stacked for the coming cold. Martha finally stepped closer, still careful not to intrude, and held out the letters. John glanced at them briefly, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. He felt a lump in his throat, a heaviness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. His hands, strong and steady from decades of work, trembled slightly as he took the letters. He didn't know what he was expecting. Anger, regret, sadness, but what he felt was a quiet ache, a reminder of a connection he had once cherished and had let slip away. For a few moments, they stood in silence. The wind whistled softly through the grasses, the cattle loud in the distance, and the woodpile grew slowly under John's hands. He felt exposed in a way he hadn't in years, as if Martha's quiet presence had pulled back a curtain he had carefully drawn around his heart. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. Instead, he nodded once, small but deliberate, and continued stacking the firewood. Martha didn't leave. She knelt down near the last row of logs, arranging them neatly, her movements precise and careful. She didn't speak, but John could sense her patience, her understanding. She wasn't here to pry. She was here to deliver, to connect, to honor a promise made long ago. And somehow, without either of them saying a word, the tension between them eased just a little. By the time the morning sun rose higher in the sky, casting bright light across the field, John had finished stacking the last of the firewood. He stood up, his back aching, his hands raw and splintered, and looked at the neat rows. He felt a small sense of accomplishment, the satisfaction of work done well. But he also felt something else, an unfamiliar warmth, a tiny crack in the wall he had built around himself. Martha looked at him, her eyes soft, and for the first time, John felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected: connection. Maybe it was the memory of his sister. Maybe it was the quiet determination of the woman who had walked onto his land and respected his space. Whatever it was, it lingered in the air, subtle but undeniable. John turned toward the barn, ready to retreat into his routine again. He wanted to say, "That's enough. You can go now." But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging her presence, and for a moment, the vast emptiness of the ranch didn't feel so lonely. The wind shifted again, ruffling the edges of the letters Martha still held in her hands. John glanced at them once more, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and fear. He didn't know what reading them would bring: memories, tears, perhaps even closure. But he knew that the day had already changed. Something in the rhythm of his life had shifted, and he wasn't entirely sure he wanted it to go back to the way it was before. The morning continued, the ranch alive with the sound of wind, wood, and distant cattle. And John Marlowe, a man used to solitude and the steady certainty of routine, felt something new stir inside him, something fragile, something uncertain, but something that promised the possibility of connection and of facing the past he had long avoided. The morning had passed quietly, but the presence of Martha lingered like a gentle echo. John Marlowe, who was used to speaking only to the cattle and the wind, felt an unfamiliar awareness of another human being nearby. He stacked the last pieces of firewood neatly. The rhythm of his work steady, yet his mind was elsewhere. Every now and then he would glance at Martha, who stood a few steps away, holding the letters with care. She didn't rush him, didn't speak unnecessarily, and in a way her patience made him feel both exposed and strangely comfortable. Martha shifted her weight slightly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and finally spoke. "I know you probably don't want me here, Mr. Marlowe," she said softly. Her voice carried a calm determination, as if she had anticipated his hesitation. "But your sister wanted you to have these. She thought—" John's hands stilled mid-motion. John's hands stilled mid-motion. He didn't want to think about his sister. He had spent years keeping her memory tucked away, folding it neatly into a corner of his mind where it wouldn't cause him pain. Yet here it was again, pulled into the open by a stranger carrying her words. He wanted to look away, to pretend he didn't care, but he couldn't. "Not entirely. I don't know why now," he said finally, his voice low and rough from disuse. "It's been years." He set down the last log and rubbed his hands on his pants, a gesture that was part nervousness, part habit. "I don't know if I'm ready for it." Martha nodded. "I understand," she said. "I can wait. You don't have to read them now." "I just wanted to bring them to you in person, like she asked." There was a quiet strength in her tone, a softness that did not demand anything from him, but gave him the space to make his own choice. John looked out over the plains, the vastness of the land stretching endlessly in every direction. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and pine, and he felt a deep, familiar ache in his chest. The ranch was his world, his routine, his comfort, but it was also a place of isolation. The sight of Martha standing there, patient and calm, made him realize just how long he had gone without any real human connection. Do you want to see the barn?" he asked after a pause, surprising himself. The words were tentative, almost like testing the water. He had never invited anyone into his personal space, not in decades, but something about Martha made him feel it could be safe. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I'd like that," she said. John led her toward the barn, stepping over uneven ground and loose stones. The barn smelled of hay, leather, and a faint hint of smoke from the stove he sometimes used in the winter. It was large but simple, with rows of tools neatly hung along the walls, and empty spaces where cattle feed and equipment were stored. He showed her the stalls where the horses slept, the tack room where saddles and bridles were carefully kept, and even the old loft where hay bales were stacked to the ceiling. Martha moved quietly, taking in every detail, her hands brushing against the rough wood, her eyes lingering on photographs hung along the walls. She didn't interrupt, didn't make noise, but her presence was like a soft echo that filled the empty spaces of the barn. John noticed small things in her demeanor. The way she paused when she saw the old photograph of him and his sister as children, the way her fingers lightly traced the edge of a faded letter stuck in a drawer. He realized she was not just curious about the ranch, she was curious about him, about his life, about the memories he had kept hidden. When they stepped outside again, the sun was higher, warming the air and softening the sharp edges of the morning chill. The cattle moved slowly across the field, their lowing blending with the distant sound of a creek. John watched them for a moment, then turned to Martha. "You said you're a teacher," he said. "What kind of letters are these?" Martha opened the first envelope carefully, as if the words inside were fragile. They're from your sister. Some are stories she wrote, some are letters she never sent. She wanted you to have them so you could know her thoughts, her feelings, and her life after she left home." John nodded slowly. He had always known that his sister had a mind of her own, a life that he could not follow, but he had never imagined receiving words from her long after she was gone. His heart ached at the thought, a deep, silent ache that he had ignored for years. I don't know if I should read them," he admitted quietly, more to himself than to her. "I don't know if I can." Martha's eyes softened. "You don't have to now, but maybe one day, when you're ready, it will help you remember her in a different way. Not just as the sister you lost, but as the person she was, her thoughts, her dreams." John looked at her, really looked at her, and noticed the sincerity in her expression. It was not pity, not intrusion, but genuine care. For a moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a flicker of trust. He wanted to push it away, to retreat back into his solitude, but he couldn't. Something about Martha's presence made the walls around his heart feel less rigid. They walked together toward the back of the ranch, where a small garden struggled against the dry soil. John had planted vegetables there last spring, hoping to make the place a little more lively, a little less empty. He showed her the rows of tomatoes and beans, the small patch of herbs near the fence. Martha crouched down to examine the plants, gently touching the leaves, and asked questions about how he managed the garden by himself. John found himself answering more freely than he had expected. He told her about the irrigation system he had built, the lessons he had learned from trial and error, and even some of the small failures he had experienced along the way. She listened intently, nodding, asking questions that encouraged him to keep speaking. For the first time that day, he realized that conversation could be gentle, even comforting, and that someone could listen without judgment or intrusion. As the afternoon stretched on, Martha helped him with small tasks around the garden, watering, tying up plants, and pulling weeds. The work was simple, but it allowed John to feel a sense of normalcy, a shared rhythm with another person. He found himself glancing at her occasionally, noticing her focus, her patience, and the quiet determination in her movements. It was different from the solitary work he was used to. It felt human. Eventually, they returned to the porch of the ranch house, where a small table and 2 chairs waited. John poured water into glasses, handed one to Martha, and sat across from her. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was comfortable, filled with the sounds of the ranch and the faint breeze through the trees. "Your sister was very thoughtful," Martha said quietly, breaking the silence. "She wanted to make sure you knew she was thinking of you, even after all these years." John nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't realize she thought about me that way," he admitted. The words felt strange coming out, as though he were uncovering a part of himself that had been buried for too long. Martha smiled gently. "She did. And I think she would be happy to see that you're still taking care of this place. She always admired your dedication." John felt a lump in his throat. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the depth of his emotions, grief, nostalgia, and a quiet sense of connection that he had long denied. He realized that the letters were more than just words. They were a bridge to the past, a reminder of love that had never truly disappeared. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting warm light across the plains, John and Martha remained on the porch, sitting quietly together. Neither spoke much, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with understanding, with unspoken recognition of loss, memory, and the possibility of something new. John Marlowe, the lonely rancher who had spent decades in solitude, felt a subtle shift inside him. The ranch still belonged to him. The plains still stretched endlessly, and the routine of stacking firewood and tending cattle would continue. But now there was something else, something fragile, something tentative, something human that had entered his life. And in that quiet moment, with the wind softly rustling the leaves and the cattle grazing in the distance, John knew that the day had changed forever. He didn't yet know what reading the letters would bring, or how much of the past he could face, but he knew he would not be facing it alone. Martha's presence had opened a door, and for the first time in years, he felt that stepping through it might not be so frightening after all. The late afternoon sun cast a soft golden glow over John Marlowe's ranch, stretching long shadows across the fields. The air was warm from the sun, but still carried a hint of the morning chill, and the faint scent of hay and earth mixed with the distant smell of wood smoke. John stood near the barn, his sleeves rolled up, hands slightly dirty from work, while Martha watched quietly. She had spent the day helping with small chores, following his instructions yet moving carefully as if she were treading on sacred ground. John had noticed repeatedly throughout the day the way she worked with care, as though she respected the land he had spent his life tending. It was different from the casual curiosity of visitors he had sometimes encountered in the past. Martha's presence didn't feel intrusive. It felt attentive, and it made him uneasy in ways he had not expected. For years he had lived alone, believing that his solitude was the only way to protect himself from the unpredictability of people. Yet here she was, quiet but persistent, gently weaving herself into the rhythm of his day. For a while, they worked side by side, stacking firewood for the upcoming winter. John's hands moved automatically, muscles remembering every motion from years of practice, but his mind wandered. He thought about his sister Mary, about the letters she had written, and about the way her words might change his understanding of her life. He had been avoiding these thoughts for years, convincing himself that memories were safer when tucked away, yet now the past seemed alive again, pressing gently at the edges of his present. Martha broke the silence. "Do you mind if I read one of the letters?" she asked softly. "I can read it out loud." "You don't have to. I just thought it might help." Her voice trailed off slightly, as though she too were careful about the feelings that had been stirred. John hesitated. He had spent decades avoiding confrontation with his emotions. The idea of hearing his sister's words aloud felt both inviting and threatening. But when he looked at her, standing there with quiet patience, he felt a small stirring of trust. Slowly, he nodded. "Go ahead," he said, his voice low. Martha opened the first envelope carefully, making sure not to tear the fragile paper. She began reading, her voice soft and deliberate, each word chosen to carry the meaning without rushing. John listened, standing near the woodpile, arms crossed, but his posture betrayed his tension. His eyes were on the distant hills, but his mind was elsewhere, absorbing every word. The letter spoke of simple things: Mary's days in the town where she had lived, her small victories and disappointments, her quiet moments of joy and solitude, but underneath the simple details were subtle hints of longing, of love, and of reflection on the life she had left behind. John's chest tightened as he listened. Memories surfaced, his sister laughing as children, her gentle teasing, and the quiet evenings they had spent sitting on the porch, watching the stars. He realized that he had never truly considered how much Mary had thought about him after she left. He had assumed she had moved on, that her life no longer intersected with his, but her words proved otherwise. She had carried pieces of him with her, just as he had carried pieces of her in the quiet corners of his mind. As Martha continued reading, John felt a shift within himself. A knot of grief he had carried for years began to loosen slightly. The familiar ache of loss was still there, but it was accompanied by something else: connection. He wasn't alone in remembering, in feeling, in grieving. His sister had left traces of herself behind, and now, through these letters, he could see the world from her perspective, understand her choices, and even, in a small way, forgive both himself and her for the years of separation. The afternoon passed slowly, the sun dipping lower in the sky, and John found himself moving closer to Martha. He didn't speak at first, but the physical proximity allowed a subtle shift, a sense of shared space that had been missing from his life for decades. He glanced at her face, noting the seriousness with which she read, the gentle way she held each letter as though it were fragile, not only in paper but in sentiment. He realized that the letters were not just words on paper. They were a bridge, a connection, and a reminder of a bond that time and distance could not erase. When Martha paused to take a breath, John spoke. She really wanted me to know this, didn't she?" His voice was soft, uncertain, but honest. Martha nodded. "Yes," she said. "She wanted you to understand her life, her choices, and how much she cared about you. She hoped these letters would bring you closer, even after all this time." John nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. He felt a strange combination of relief and sadness, relief that his sister's intentions had been kind, and sadness for the years they had lost. Yet, for the first time in a long while, he felt a willingness to engage with the past, to see it not as something that had been stolen from him, but as something that could still be understood, appreciated, and remembered. He watched Martha carefully, noticing the subtle expressions on her face, the faint lift of her eyebrows, the gentle softness around her eyes, and the quiet determination that suggested she had endured much herself to make this delivery. She wasn't just reading letters, she was participating in a delicate act of healing, and John realized that her presence mattered as much as the letters themselves. Can I read one myself?" he asked hesitantly, surprising himself. Martha smiled, a small, encouraging smile. "Of course," she said. "Take your time. There's no rush." John unfolded the next letter with care, feeling the texture of the paper beneath his fingers. As he began reading, he was struck by the way Mary had described small moments, the scent of the rain, the taste of fresh bread, the quiet joy of a neighbor's kindness. But there was also an undercurrent of reflection, of regret, and of hope that he could understand now. Her words were simple, but their impact was profound. John felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he didn't turn away. He let the emotions rise, letting the letters do what they were meant to do, bridge the gap between past and present. For the first time that day, John felt truly vulnerable. The loneliness he had carried for decades was still there, but it was no longer suffocating. It had softened in the presence of understanding, patience, and shared grief. Martha's quiet companionship allowed him to process feelings he had long ignored. He realized that connection wasn't something to fear, it was something to accept, carefully, step by step. Hours passed, and the sun dipped lower, casting warm orange light across the ranch. The shadows of the barn stretched long across the ground. The cattle moved slowly through the fields, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of earth and wood. John and Martha remained near the firewood stack, reading, talking, and occasionally pausing in comfortable silence. Each letter brought new insights, new memories, and new layers of understanding about his sister and about himself. At one point, John stopped reading, folding the letter carefully and setting it down. He looked at Martha and spoke quietly. I didn't know she thought about me this much," he admitted, his voice low but steady. I thought she had moved on, that I was just left behind." Martha placed a gentle hand on the letter.
She never stopped thinking about you, she said. Even when she had her own life, she carried you in her heart.
That's why she wanted me to bring these letters. She wanted you to know that you were never truly alone. John nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He realized that his sister had understood the isolation he had felt, even from afar, and that her love had persisted despite distance and time. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel both sadness and gratitude simultaneously. He understood now that grief and love could coexist, that loss didn't mean forgetting, and that remembering didn't have to hurt as much as he feared. The ranch, once a place of routine and solitude, now felt alive with memory and presence. The firewood, neatly stacked, symbolized not just preparation for winter, but also the careful layering of connections, emotions, and memories that John had been protecting for decades. He realized that life, even in isolation, was enriched by small acts of courage, like opening letters, like listening, like being present with someone who understood. As the evening approached, John and Martha sat on the porch, the letters resting between them. The sky was painted with shades of pink and gold, and the distant mountains stood silent and immovable. The ranch seemed larger somehow, filled with the invisible presence of his sister, and John felt an unfamiliar calm. The day had brought confrontation with the past, emotional vulnerability, and the beginnings of healing. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but he felt ready to face it, bolstered by the letters and by Martha's quiet support. For the first time in a long time, John Marlowe felt that he could allow himself to grieve, to remember, and perhaps even to begin forgiving, not only his sister for leaving, but also himself for the years he had spent in isolation. And as he watched the last light of the day fade over the plains, he understood that healing was not a sudden event, but a gentle process. One step, one letter, one shared moment at a time. The evening settled over the ranch with a quiet stillness that seemed almost sacred. The sky was a deep, soft blue, streaked with the last hints of pink and gold from the setting sun. The cattle were resting, the horses lowed quietly in their stalls, and the wind whispered gently through the tall grasses. John Marlowe sat on the porch steps, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the letters spread before him on the wooden boards. Each envelope, carefully opened and unfolded, carried more than words. It carried memories, emotions, and pieces of a life he had never fully known. Martha sat beside him, her presence steady and calm, a quiet support that allowed John to feel more grounded than he had in years. They didn't speak at first. The only sounds were the distant rustle of leaves, the occasional call of a bird returning to its nest, and the subtle creak of the porch boards beneath them. John felt a strange combination of fatigue and alertness. The emotional weight of the day pressed down on him, but it was not entirely unpleasant. It was heavy with meaning, with recognition, and with the first glimmers of understanding that he had been missing all these years. Finally, John spoke, his voice low and uncertain. I never realized how much she thought about me. I thought she had moved on, that I was forgotten." His fingers traced the edges of a folded letter. "But she wanted me to know. She wanted me to understand." Martha nodded gently. "She did," she said. "She carried you in her heart, even when her life took her far from here. She wanted you to see that your bond didn't end, even though she left." John's eyes drifted over the distant hills, now bathed in the soft glow of twilight. He felt a lump in his throat and a sudden tightness in his chest, emotions he had carefully locked away for decades. He realized how long he had avoided thinking about his sister, how he had convinced himself that solitude and routine were enough to fill the emptiness inside. And yet, as he read the letters, he understood that what he had truly missed wasn't the company of others. It was connection, understanding, and the acknowledgement of love that never truly left. "I think I understand some of what she wanted," John admitted quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "But it's hard. I don't know how to feel it all at once." Martha reached out gently and placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was careful, respectful, but firm enough to anchor him. "You don't have to feel it all at once," she said softly. "Don't have to feel it all at once. Start small. Let it come naturally. Remembering doesn't have to hurt. It can be comforting, too, if you let it." John nodded slowly. He had never allowed himself to process grief like this before, never allowed himself to feel the depth of his emotions without pushing them aside with work or routine. But now, with Martha there beside him, he realized that it was possible to face these feelings, to let them flow without fear. He felt a tear form in the corner of his eye, and for a moment he allowed it to fall freely. Martha did not look away. She simply watched, quietly supportive, letting him experience the emotion without judgment or interruption. After a long moment of silence, John picked up one of the letters again. This one was different. It was not just a simple recounting of daily life. It was filled with reflection, with memories, with the hopes Mary had carried for him and for their relationship. As John read, his voice trembled slightly, though he did not attempt to hide it. Words he had never allowed himself to speak aloud began to rise in his chest, and he realized he was not alone in this feeling. Do you think she knew I'd never forgive myself for not being there?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to Martha.
She probably did, Martha replied gently. But she also wanted you to understand that her love for you was never conditional.
She didn't blame you, and she didn't expect you to carry guilt. She just wanted you to know she cared, that she always cared. John swallowed hard, the weight of the years pressing against him. He realized he had been carrying not only grief for her loss, but also a burden of guilt that was never hers to place. The letters were helping him untangle the emotions, layer by layer, guiding him toward understanding and acceptance. For hours they continued in this way, reading, talking softly, pausing to reflect, and sometimes simply sitting in silence. Each letter revealed more about Mary, about her joys, her struggles, and her quiet courage in facing life far from the ranch. John found himself laughing quietly at her humor, feeling a warm ache at her sorrows, and slowly letting himself feel the depth of the bond they had shared as siblings. At one point, Martha placed her hand gently on one of the envelopes.
"She wanted you to remember the good times too," she said.
Not just the hard moments. She wanted you to feel joy, even in memory. John nodded, closing his eyes briefly.
He remembered evenings on the porch with his sister, the sound of laughter echoing across the fields, the smell of fresh bread baking in the house, and the quiet, comforting presence of someone who understood him completely. The memories were bittersweet, but they also carried a warmth he had almost forgotten. The sky darkened slowly, stars beginning to pierce the deep blue of night. John looked up, feeling a connection not only to his sister but to the world around him. The land, the ranch, the endless plains, and the quiet presence of Martha beside him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, fragile yet real, settling over him. I think I can start to forgive myself, John admitted quietly. I think I can remember her without feeling the weight of all the years I missed. Martha smiled gently. That's all she wanted, she said. For you to remember her with love, not with pain. For you to feel connected again, even if it's just in small ways. John nodded, feeling a quiet gratitude. He realized that the act of reading the letters, of engaging with the memories, and of sharing the experience with someone who understood, had opened a door he didn't know he needed. He had spent decades guarding his heart, believing that solitude was safety. But now he saw that connection, even fragile and tentative, could bring healing. They continued to sit together on the porch, the letters resting between them, the night settling gently around the ranch. John found himself speaking more freely than he had in years, sharing stories of his childhood, of times with his sister that had brought him joy, of moments of regret he had kept locked away. Martha listened patiently, encouragingly, without judgment, and John felt a sense of release he had long denied himself. Eventually, John set the letters down carefully. He looked at Martha, a quiet seriousness in his expression. Thank you, he said simply, for bringing them here, for staying, for helping me face this. You don't need to thank me, she said. Your sister asked me to deliver them because she knew you would need someone patient with you. I'm just glad I could be here. John nodded, feeling the full weight of her words. For the first time in decades, he felt the possibility of healing, of connection, and of remembering without pain. The ranch, which had been a place of solitude and routine, now felt alive with memory, with presence, and with the quiet hope of something new. As the night deepened, John and Martha finally stood, stretching from hours of sitting on the porch. The letters were stacked neatly, ready to be read again another day, each one a testament to the enduring bond between siblings and the quiet courage of facing one's emotions. John felt a strange lightness in his chest, a sense of relief mixed with warmth. He realized that grief did not have to be endless, that memory could be comforting, and that connection, even with a stranger, could help bridge the gaps left by time and distance. Before leaving, Martha looked at John. You've done well today, she said softly, not just with the letters, but with yourself. You faced the past, and that's not easy. John nodded, a small, genuine smile appearing on his face. I think I finally understand her better, he admitted. In a small way, I understand myself better too. Martha smiled, and for a moment the two of them simply stood there, sharing the quiet beauty of the ranch at night, the letters lying between them, and the knowledge that the past, no matter how heavy, could be faced with patience, love, and understanding. That night, as John went inside the ranch house and prepared a small meal, he felt a sense of closure he had never thought possible. The letters had not erased his grief, nor had they removed the solitude he had known for so long, but they had reminded him of something far more powerful, the enduring strength of love, memory, and human connection. For the first time in years, John Marlowe felt that he could let himself be vulnerable, that he could allow memories to surface without fear, and that he could carry his sister's love with him, even in her absence. The ranch no longer felt like a place of loneliness. It was a place of reflection, healing, and quiet possibility. And as the night settled fully over the plains, John Marlowe finally felt ready to face tomorrow, not alone, but with the gentle presence of understanding and connection that had entered his life, quietly and unexpectedly, that evening. Brushing against the tall grasses and stirring the leaves of the few trees scattered around the ranch, John Marlowe stepped outside, stretching his arms and shoulders, feeling the ache of yesterday's work, but also a quiet sense of energy and purpose. For the first time in weeks, or maybe even years, he felt ready to embrace the day, not merely as a series of tasks, but as a chance to move forward, to carry memories with him while opening his heart to the world around him. Martha was already up, moving quietly through the yard, gathering tools and preparing to help with chores. She had spent the night in the small guest room at the ranch, but neither of them had felt the need for small talk or explanations. There had been a shared understanding between them, a bond formed through letters, stories, and silent presence. The letters from his sister had begun to do their work, slowly guiding John toward acceptance, memory, and the realization that life, even after loss, could still hold joy and connection. John poured himself a cup of coffee from the small stove in the kitchen and stepped onto the porch, where the first rays of sun warmed the wooden boards beneath his feet. He looked at Martha and nodded quietly. "Ready for the day?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though his voice carried a quiet warmth he hadn't known in a long time. Martha smiled. "I am," she said softly. "And you?" John nodded again. "I think so," he said. "Let's start with the cattle today. Then we can finish stacking the rest of the firewood." They moved together through the ranch, checking the fences, feeding the animals, and inspecting the barns. The rhythm of work felt different this morning. It was not just a routine of survival. It was shared, deliberate, and purposeful. John noticed how Martha moved with care and efficiency, her attention to detail reminding him that life could be gentle yet strong at the same time. He began to feel an unfamiliar but pleasant sense of companionship, something he had long assumed was impossible for him. As they worked, John found himself talking more freely than he had in years. He spoke of his sister, of memories long buried, of times when he had felt lonely and unsure. Martha listened patiently, her eyes soft, her posture relaxed, and her presence steady. She did not offer advice or judgment. She simply listened, allowing him to speak without interruption. It was a gift he had never realized he needed. Someone to witness his story, acknowledge his feelings, and allow him to carry his grief without fear of ridicule or pity. By late morning they had finished with the cattle and were moving toward the remaining firewood. The stack was nearly complete, but there were still several heavy logs to lift and arrange. John noticed the way Martha's hands moved deliberately, her touch careful and precise. He felt a small smile tug at his lips, realizing that he could enjoy this day, this work, and this company without feeling burdened or distracted. As they lifted and stacked, John felt a sudden wave of emotion. He glanced at Martha, noticing her focus and calm, and suddenly remembered a moment from his childhood, a time when his sister had helped him stack firewood, laughing at his mistakes and teasing him gently. The memory brought tears to his eyes, but instead of turning away, he let them fall, acknowledging the grief, the love, and the warmth that came with it. She didn't comment or ask if he was okay. She simply moved a little closer and continued stacking alongside him. Her quiet support allowed John to feel that he could express his emotions openly, without fear. He realized that this simple act, working side by side, sharing silence and effort, was as meaningful as any conversation or letter. It was a connection rooted in the present, grounded in trust and shared experience. When the last log was finally stacked, John stepped back and admired their work. The pile was neat, organized, and strong, ready to sustain them through the harsh winter months. But more than that, it was a symbol, a testament to patience, effort, and cooperation. He looked at Martha, feeling a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in decades. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for helping, for everything." "You did most of the work," she said, though the smile carried no false modesty. "I'm just glad to be here."
No, it's more than that.
"You helped me see things differently. You helped me remember. And you made me feel less alone." His voice trembled slightly, but he did not shy away from the words. Martha looked at him, her eyes soft and kind. "You've carried a lot on your own, John," she said. "But you don't have to anymore. You can keep her memory alive, and you can keep living your life. There's room for both." John nodded slowly, feeling the truth of her words. For the first time, he realized that healing didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean letting go of the past entirely. It meant embracing it, understanding it, and carrying it forward while still making space for the present and future. The rest of the afternoon was spent in quiet activity. John repaired a fence, Martha tended a small garden patch, and they shared small conversations about the land, the weather, and their hopes for the coming months. The ranch, once a place of routine and solitude, now felt alive with shared effort, memory, and human connection. Every sound, the lowing of cattle, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of birds, seemed more vivid, more meaningful, and more alive. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, John and Martha returned to the porch. They sat together quietly, the letters resting on the small table between them. John felt a sense of calm settle over him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fading sun. It was the quiet satisfaction of understanding, of connection, and of acceptance. "I think she would be proud of this," John said softly, looking at the letters. "Not just the work, but this. Me finally facing things. Me finally remembering her without letting it hurt too much." "She would," she said, "and I think she would be glad you're not alone anymore." John felt a lump in his throat. He realized how much he had longed for someone to understand him, to share the burden of memory and grief, and to simply be present without expectation. Martha's presence had done that, gently, patiently, and without judgment. He felt a connection that was rare and precious, and he knew he would carry it with him long after she left. Night fell, the first stars appearing against the deep blue sky. The ranch was quiet, except for the soft sounds of animals settling in for the night, and the gentle whisper of wind through the grasses. John looked out across the fields, feeling a sense of belonging and peace he had never known before. The past was still there, the letters still held their weight, but now he felt ready to carry them without fear. Martha stood, brushing her hands together and smiling softly. "I should be going soon," she said. "The town isn't too far, but it's getting late." John nodded, a faint sadness tugging at him. I understand," he said. "Thank you for staying, for bringing her letters, for everything." Martha smiled again, this time with warmth that reached her eyes. "You're welcome," she said. "Take care of yourself, John. And take care of this place, too. It's more than just land. It's a home, and it's full of memory, love, and life. Don't forget that." John watched her walk toward the gate, the soft light of the stars illuminating her path. When she reached the edge of the property, she turned and gave him a small wave, and he waved back, feeling a quiet gratitude for her presence and for the role she had played in his life, even for a brief time. After she left, John returned to the porch, sitting with the letters and the quiet of the night around him. He realized that life would continue, the seasons would change, and the work on the ranch would always demand effort. But now he understood that he didn't have to face it all alone. The letters had reminded him of the past, but Martha had reminded him of the present, and that there was hope, connection, and peace to be found in both. For the first time in years, John Marlowe allowed himself to feel fully present. The ranch, the plains, the letters, and the memories of his sister all existed together, woven into a tapestry of life that was beautiful, complex, and meaningful. He knew that grief would come and go, that memories would stir tears and smiles alike, but he also knew that he could face them. He could remember, he could grieve, and he could still embrace the quiet joys of life and the connections that made it richer. As he finally went inside to prepare for the night, John felt a calm determination. The ranch would continue to thrive, the work would continue, and he would continue to live, fully, thoughtfully, and with the quiet strength that comes from understanding, love, and connection. The firewood was stacked, the letters carefully preserved, and the night held the promise of tomorrow. And for the first time in a long time, John Marlowe did not feel lonely.